In the summer of 1896, a photograph was taken at a lavish garden party in the English countryside. For over a century, this image sat quietly in archives, dismissed as just another snapshot of Victorian leisure. But when historian Delilah Silas examined the photograph in 2019, she noticed something peculiar clutched in the hand of a young woman standing near the rose garden. What she discovered would unravel a conspiracy that had been hidden for more than 100 years, revealing a truth so disturbing that it would challenge everything we thought we knew about that golden age. The photograph arrived at the British Historical Archive in a collection donated by the descendants of the Ashworth family, wealthy industrialists who had made their fortune in textiles during the height of the British Empire. Delilah Silas, a specialist in Victorian photography and social history, was tasked with cataloging the family's extensive collection of images. Most were unremarkable: posed portraits, formal gatherings, and scenic landscapes typical of the era. But this particular photograph from the garden party stood out, not for what it obviously showed, but for what it subtly concealed. The image depicted approximately 30 guests scattered across a manicured lawn, the women in elaborate white dresses with parasols, the men in dark suits and top hats. At first glance, it appeared to be a celebration of wealth and refinement, a frozen moment of Gilded Age prosperity. But Delilah's trained eye caught something unusual. In the far left corner of the photograph, partially obscured by the shadow of an oak tree, stood a young woman whose posture seemed oddly tense. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, and in her right hand she held an object that didn't quite fit the scene. Delilah brought in Hannah Noah, a digital imaging specialist, to enhance the photograph using modern technology. As Hannah carefully increased the resolution and adjusted the contrast, the mysterious object began to reveal itself with startling clarity. It wasn't a fan, as Delilah had initially suspected, nor was it a decorative handkerchief or any other accessory common to Victorian fashion. What emerged from the digital enhancement was far more sinister. The woman was holding what appeared to be a small glass vial, the kind typically used by physicians and chemists of the period. This discovery sent Delilah down a rabbit hole of research. She began cross-referencing the Ashworth family records with contemporary newspaper accounts, medical journals, and police reports from the 1890s. What she uncovered was a pattern that had been deliberately obscured by powerful families for generations. The garden party wasn't simply a social gathering. It was a meeting of a secret society known as the Crimson Circle, a group of wealthy elites who had been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on vulnerable populations. Aaron Theo, an archivist specializing in Victorian criminal records, joined Delilah's investigation when she reached out to him about peculiar deaths that had occurred in the months surrounding the garden party. Aaron had spent years documenting unsolved cases from the late 19th century, and he immediately recognized connections that Delilah had begun to trace. Together, they discovered that at least 17 people, mostly servants and factory workers employed by families present at the garden party, had died under mysterious circumstances between May and October of 1896. The deaths had been attributed to various causes: consumption, fever, heart failure, accidents. But when Aaron and Delilah examined the original death certificates and autopsy reports, they found disturbing similarities. Many of the victims had exhibited unusual symptoms before their deaths: severe neurological disturbances, unexplained paralysis, and organ failure that didn't match the stated causes of death. The medical examiners of the time had noted these inconsistencies, but had been pressured to sign off on conventional diagnoses by influential figures connected to the deceased's employers. Maya Thomas, a toxicologist and historian of pharmaceutical practices, became the third member of the investigative team. Delilah had contacted her after discovering references to experimental compounds in the private journals of Dr. Edmund Ashworth, the patriarch of the family and a respected physician in London. Maya's expertise in historical poisons and early pharmaceutical development proved crucial in understanding what the Crimson Circle had been doing. Dr. Ashworth's journals, which had been sealed in a locked trunk along with the photograph collection, contained detailed records of experiments involving various chemical compounds. He had been testing substances derived from plants, minerals, and even animal venoms on human subjects without their knowledge or consent. The journal entries were clinical and detached, describing the subjects only by numbers and documenting their reactions to different dosages with the cold precision of someone conducting research on laboratory animals rather than human beings. The glass vial in the photograph, Maya determined, likely contained one of these experimental compounds. By analyzing the descriptions in Dr. Ashworth's journals and comparing them with known toxins of the era, she identified the substance as a derivative of strychnine, mixed with an alkaloid extracted from a rare South American plant. This combination would have caused the exact symptoms documented in the mysterious deaths: initial euphoria, followed by severe muscle spasms, respiratory distress, and eventual cardiac arrest. But why would someone be holding such a substance openly at a garden party? The answer lay in understanding the true nature of the gathering. The Crimson Circle didn't meet to discuss their experiments in shadowy back rooms. They celebrated their work in plain sight, confident that their wealth and social position made them untouchable. The garden party was actually a ceremony marking the completion of a successful testing phase. The young woman holding the vial was likely presenting it to the group, a trophy of sorts representing their latest achievement in what they considered cutting-edge medical research. Delilah identified the woman in the photograph as Catherine Whitmore, the 23-year-old daughter of a prominent banker. Catherine's own diary, discovered in a separate archive, revealed her enthusiastic participation in the Crimson Circle's activities. She wrote about the experiments with a chilling mixture of scientific curiosity and complete disregard for human life. In one entry, dated June 1896, she described administering the experimental compound to a housemaid under the guise of providing medicine for a headache, then meticulously documenting the woman's deterioration over the following week. The investigation took a darker turn when Aaron discovered that the Crimson Circle's activities hadn't been limited to England. Ships' manifests and immigration records showed that several members of the group had traveled extensively to British colonies in Africa and India during the 1890s. Correspondence between Dr. Ashworth and colonial administrators suggested that they had conducted even more extensive experiments in these overseas territories, where they faced even less oversight and accountability. Hannah's digital enhancement work revealed another crucial detail in the photograph. When she examined the background more closely, she noticed a second figure partially hidden behind a garden hedge. This person, dressed in servant's clothing, appeared to be watching the gathering with an expression of terror. Further research into the Ashworth household staff records identified this individual as Margaret Price, a kitchen maid who had worked for the family for 3 years. Margaret's fate became a focal point of the investigation. Parish records showed that she had died just 2 weeks after the garden party, officially from pneumonia. But her death certificate bore the signature of Dr. Ashworth himself, who had listed himself as the attending physician. The circumstances of her death, combined with her presence at the garden party and her obvious distress in the photograph, suggested that she had discovered something about the Crimson Circle's activities and had been silenced. Delilah found a fragmentary letter in the archives written by Margaret to her sister in Wales, dated the day before the garden party. In it, Margaret wrote cryptically about having seen terrible things in the Ashworth household and fearing for her safety. She mentioned finding bottles of strange substances in Dr. Ashworth's study and overhearing conversations about experiments. The letter ended abruptly, suggesting it had never been completed or sent. Margaret's sister had apparently received nothing, as there was no reply in the correspondence files. The scope of the conspiracy began to emerge more fully as the team continued their research. The Crimson Circle included not just wealthy industrialists and physicians, but also prominent politicians, judges, and even members of the clergy. These individuals used their positions of power to protect each other and to provide access to vulnerable populations for their experiments. Orphanages, workhouses, and hospitals all became hunting grounds for test subjects who could disappear without anyone asking questions. Maya discovered that the experimental compounds developed by the Crimson Circle had eventually been refined and used in legitimate medical applications, though the origins of the research had been carefully scrubbed from the official records. Several drugs that became widely prescribed in the early 20th century had their roots in the unethical experiments conducted by Dr. Ashworth and his associates. The pharmaceutical companies that later produced these medications had no idea they were profiting from research built on human suffering and death. The investigation reached a critical juncture when Delilah received an anonymous email warning her to stop her research. The message was brief but unambiguous. Some secrets were meant to stay buried, and continuing to dig would have consequences. She immediately contacted Aaron and Maya, and together they decided to document everything they had discovered and submit their findings to multiple academic journals simultaneously, reasoning that widespread publication would offer some protection. Before they could publish, however, Aaron made a breakthrough that elevated the story from historical injustice to something far more immediate and terrifying. While searching through more recent records, he found evidence that the Ashworth family's pharmaceutical company, which still existed under a different name, had been accused of conducting unauthorized drug trials in developing countries as recently as the 1990s. The accusations had been settled quietly out of court, with substantial payments made to victims' families in exchange for non-disclosure agreements. The pattern was unmistakable. The Crimson Circle's legacy of exploitation and unethical experimentation had continued across generations, adapting to new times and circumstances but never truly ending. The company's internal documents, obtained through a confidential source, showed that executives had been aware of the historical record and had actually studied Dr. Ashworth's journals for insights into conducting covert research. They had learned from their predecessors not just about chemistry and pharmacology, but about how to use wealth and power to escape accountability. Hannah made one final discovery in the photograph that brought the entire story into sharp focus. Using advanced imaging technology, she was able to read the inscription on a banner hanging behind the gathering. It had been too faded to see in the original photograph, but digital enhancement revealed the words, "Progress through knowledge, power through understanding." This motto appeared in the modern pharmaceutical company's corporate materials, a direct link connecting the Garden Party of 1896 to a multinational corporation operating in the present day. The young woman holding the vial, Catherine Whitmore, had lived until 1954, dying peacefully at the age of 81. She had never faced any consequences for her participation in the Crimson Circle's experiments. Her obituary in the London Times praised her charitable work and her contributions to medical research funding. The irony was devastating. A woman who had poisoned innocent people was remembered as a philanthropist and patron of the healing arts. Dr. Edmund Ashworth had been even more successful at concealing his crimes. He had been knighted in 1902 for his contributions to medicine and had served as president of the Royal College of Physicians. His textbooks on pharmacology had been used to train medical students for decades. Streets and hospital wings bore his name. Only now, more than a century after his death, was the truth about his work finally coming to light. The team discovered that at least 47 people had died as a result of the Crimson Circle's experiments, though the true number was likely much higher. These were the cases they could document definitively. Countless others had probably suffered and died without leaving any trace in the historical record, their deaths attributed to natural causes or accidents, their stories lost to time and the deliberate destruction of evidence. When Delilah, Aaron, Hannah, and Maya finally published their findings in a comprehensive paper, the response was explosive. Descendants of the Crimson Circle families attempted to discredit the research, hiring their own historians to challenge the evidence. The pharmaceutical company issued denials and threatened legal action. But the documentation was too thorough, the connections too clear to dismiss. Media outlets around the world picked up the story, and the photograph of the garden party became an iconic image representing the dark side of scientific progress and the abuse of power. The British government launched an official inquiry into the Crimson Circle's activities and the subsequent cover-up. Institutions that had honored members of the group began the process of removing their names from buildings and revoking posthumous honors. The pharmaceutical company faced renewed scrutiny of its practices and was eventually forced to establish a substantial fund to compensate victims of historical, unethical experiments and to support medical ethics research. But perhaps the most significant outcome was a broader conversation about accountability and the long shadow of historical injustice. The story of the garden party photograph became a catalyst for examining how powerful institutions protect themselves and how truth can be buried but never completely destroyed. It raised uncomfortable questions about whose stories get preserved and whose get erased, about who benefits from forgetting and who pays the price for remembering. Maya reflected on the case in a later interview, noting that every major medical advance in history had been accompanied by ethical failures and exploitation. The challenge, she argued, was not to simply condemn the past, but to learn from it and ensure that contemporary research adhered to higher standards. The Crimson Circle's experiments had been legal by the standards of their time, which was precisely the problem. Laws and ethics had to evolve to protect the vulnerable, and vigilance was required to prevent new forms of exploitation from taking root. Aaron pointed out that the anonymous warning Delilah had received demonstrated that there were still people invested in keeping these secrets buried. The fact that such warnings were issued more than a century after the crimes occurred suggested that the reach of wealthy families and powerful institutions extended far beyond what most people imagined. Truth-seeking, he emphasized, always carried risks, but those risks had to be balanced against the moral obligation to expose injustice. Hannah's work on the photograph had demonstrated how technology could be used to recover lost histories and challenge official narratives. The digital enhancement techniques she had employed were now being applied to other historical images, revealing details that had been invisible for decades or centuries. Each new discovery had the potential to rewrite accepted histories and to give voice to people who had been silenced. Delilah summarized the experience by saying that the photograph had taught her an important lesson about appearance and reality. The garden party looked innocent and civilized in the image, a perfect representation of Victorian elegance and refinement. But beneath that surface lay cruelty, exploitation, and a complete disregard for human dignity. The lesson applied not just to history, but to the present day. Institutions and individuals that presented themselves as respectable and benevolent often concealed darker truths, and it was the responsibility of researchers, journalists, and citizens to look beyond appearances and ask difficult questions. The glass vial in Catherine Whitmore's hand had become a symbol of something larger than just one woman's crime or even one group's conspiracy. It represented the dangers of unchecked power, the ease with which human beings could be reduced to experimental subjects, and the lengths to which the privileged would go to protect their interests. It also represented the possibility of truth emerging from darkness, of careful research and dedicated inquiry bringing hidden crimes to light even after generations of concealment. The story of the 1896 garden party photograph ultimately became a reminder that history is not a settled matter, that new evidence and new perspectives can radically alter our understanding of the past. The seemingly normal image of well-dressed people at a summer gathering had concealed a nightmare of exploitation and death. Only through the efforts of researchers who refused to accept official accounts and who followed the evidence wherever it led did the truth finally emerge. What happened to those 17 documented victims, and to the countless others whose deaths went unrecorded, was an injustice that could never be fully rectified. They died in pain and fear, treated as expendable resources by people who saw themselves as advancing human knowledge. Their names, in most cases, were recovered only through the painstaking work of Delilah, Aaron, Hannah, and Maya. Now, those names were part of the historical record, their suffering acknowledged and their humanity restored. The photograph still hangs in the British Historical Archive, but it is now displayed with extensive context explaining what it truly depicts. Visitors who see it understand that they are looking not at a pleasant social gathering, but at a meeting of people who committed terrible crimes and evaded justice. The young woman holding the glass vial is no longer anonymous but identified as Catherine Whitmore, participant in unethical experiments that killed dozens of innocent people. The terrified servant in the background is recognized as Margaret Price, who likely died for what she knew. This transformation of how we see and understand the photograph reflects a broader shift in historical consciousness. We can no longer afford to view the past through the comfortable lens of nostalgia or to accept at face value the official stories told by powerful institutions. Every image, every document, every monument must be examined critically and understood in its full context, including the voices and experiences of those who were marginalized or silenced. The controversy surrounding the garden party photograph and the Crimson Circle's experiments continues to generate discussion and debate. Some argue that the focus on historical crimes distracts from contemporary issues and that we cannot judge the past by present-day ethical standards. Others insist that confronting historical injustice is essential for preventing its repetition and for building a more equitable future. What remains beyond debate is that the photograph and the story it tells have permanently changed how we view Victorian society and the supposed golden age of British prosperity. So, what can we learn from a photograph taken more than a century ago at a garden party? We learn that evil often wears a respectable face, that scientific progress can be built on a foundation of suffering, and that the powerful will use every resource at their disposal to conceal their crimes. We learn that truth can be buried but not destroyed, that careful research and moral courage can bring hidden histories to light. We learn that the victims of injustice deserve to be remembered and honored, even when decades or centuries have passed. Most importantly, we learn to look more carefully at the images and stories presented to us, to question official narratives, and to seek out the voices of those who have been excluded from mainstream accounts. The glass vial in Catherine Whitmore's hand was invisible to casual observers for over 100 years. Only when someone looked closely and asked difficult questions did its terrible significance become clear. How many other photographs, documents, and monuments conceal similar secrets? How many other stories remain to be uncovered? The work of historical inquiry is never finished, and every generation must take up the responsibility of examining the past with fresh eyes and honest hearts. What dark secrets might be hiding in the historical images we encounter every day? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that challenge what we think we know about history.